The next 60 seconds destroyed one man's career and saved the future of hundreds of families. Nobody in that luxury dining room realized the quiet waiter standing behind the billionaire understood every word being spoken, until he exposed the one lie nobody else could hear. Stay with me, because what happened next changed Brian Robinson's life forever. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I've got another unforgettable story coming your way soon. Before we jump back in, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who's listening from around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. The chandelier light caught the pen an inch above the paper, and it stopped there. Evelyn Ashford's hand hovered over her own signature line, close enough to finish the biggest deal of her career, close enough that everyone in the room had already started composing their congratulations in their heads. 14 months of work sat under that pen, hundreds of jobs, a neighborhood that had been waiting a long time for somebody to bet on it. Behind her chair, a coffee pot trembled in Brian Robinson's grip. Not from clumsiness, from the sentence climbing up his throat that he knew could end his career the second it left his mouth. He had spent the last hour convincing himself he was wrong. Wrong about the pauses, wrong about the way certain words kept losing their warmth on the way from one language to the other. He was not wrong, and some part of him had known that for the last 10 minutes, the part that kept his hands moving and his face still while everything underneath him came apart. The translator sitting beside Evelyn wore the same polite, easy smile he'd worn all afternoon. The smile that had somehow turned a dozen generous offers into insults nobody in that room had noticed but him. Brian set the coffee pot down on the tray, quietly, carefully, like a man setting down the last thing standing between him and a decision he couldn't take back. He leaned in, just far enough that only Evelyn would hear him. "Ma'am, your translator is lying to you." Nobody moved. A fork stopped halfway to somebody's mouth. The man in the brown suit near the end of the table turned his head slowly, the way you turn when you're sure you heard something wrong and you're waiting for the world to correct itself. It didn't. Security by the door straightened. The restaurant manager, watching from the hallway, went the color of the tablecloth. In 11 years, nobody on that floor had ever seen a waiter speak before being spoken to, let alone say something like that to the most important guest the hotel had hosted all year. Evelyn didn't flinch. That was the first thing Brian noticed, the thing that would stay with him long after that day was over. She didn't call for security. She didn't laugh him off. She turned in her chair, slow and deliberate, and studied the man who had just risked everything he had to open his mouth. "What did you just say to me?" Brian's heart was doing something violent behind his ribs. He thought about Maya, about the rent due in 9 days, about the box of certifications in his closet nobody at this hotel had ever asked to see. He thought about how easy it would have been to keep pouring coffee and let the deal fall apart around a stranger's lie, and how none of that would have been his fault. It would have been so easy. He opened his mouth anyway. 6 hours earlier, none of this existed yet. Brian's morning had started the way it always did, quiet, before the sun, in a kitchen too small for the two of them and just big enough anyway. 9-year-old Maya sat cross-legged on the counter stool, narrating her lunch order like she was placing it with a waiter far fussier than her father. "No crust today," she said. "I'm an adult now." "Since when?" "Since Tuesday." Brian laughed, the kind of laugh that cost him nothing and gave Maya everything. He packed her lunch around a stack of envelopes he'd shoved under last week's mail, the kind with little plastic windows he didn't need to open to know what they said. He walked her to school the long way, past the bakery she liked to look at even though they never went in. At the gate, she hugged him twice, which was her way of telling him she'd noticed something was off, even if she couldn't say what it was. "Tonight," he told her, "no matter how late, we eat together." She believed him. She always did. What Maya didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that the man walking her to school had once been 3 years from a career in international diplomacy. French good enough to charm a room, German good enough to argue in. A transcript with his name near the top of it, boxed up in a closet he hadn't opened in years. That version of Brian didn't die all at once. It went quiet the same week his wife did, buried under a hospital bill, then another, then a little girl who needed someone to show up every single day without fail. The Ashford Grand Hotel didn't ask him to be anything more than a man who could carry a tray without spilling it, and for a long time that had felt like enough. He didn't know that in 6 hours, the two halves of his life, the waiter and the diplomat, were about to collide in the middle of the most important room in the building. That morning he clocked in like any other day. The restaurant manager gathered the floor staff before the doors opened, his voice tight with the kind of pressure that trickled down from somewhere above him. "Today's guest built half the jobs in this city out of nothing," he said. "Do not embarrass me." Brian nodded along with everyone else, straightened his tie, and picked up a tray he'd carried 1,000 times before. He had no idea he was about to become the only person in that room who could hear what was actually being said, or that 6 words were waiting for him on the other side of that afternoon. The kind of words that don't just end a shift. They end everything you thought your life was going to be, and start something you never let yourself hope for. If you've ever carried more than the people around you could see, stay with this one. It only gets heavier from here. Brian tied his apron behind his back at 6:45, same as every morning, and stepped onto the restaurant floor like a man walking into a life that had never quite fit him, but that he'd learned to wear anyway. The Ashford Grand's private dining room was already being dressed for the day. Linen pressed sharp enough to cut paper, crystal polished until it threw light across the ceiling, fresh flowers arranged by someone who got paid more to arrange them than Brian did to serve the people who'd smell them for 30 seconds and forget them by lunch. Nobody here knew what he used to be. To the other waiters, Brian was just steady, reliable, the guy who never called out, never complained, never let his face show whatever was going on behind it. 2 of the younger servers joked around him most mornings, tossing commentary back and forth about guests and tips and whose section was better, and Brian laughed along in the right places without ever really being part of it. He'd gotten good at that, being present without being seen. Only one person on that floor ever looked at him like he might be more than what the uniform suggested. Walter had worked the kitchen at the Ashford Grand for almost 30 years, long enough to have outlasted 4 general managers and at least 2 full renovations. He didn't say much to anyone, but every so often, usually while Brian was folding napkins into precise triangles or checking a wine list against an order nobody else would have bothered double-checking, Walter would glance over and shake his head slightly, like he was looking at a math problem that didn't add up. "You're too educated for this place," he said that morning, sliding a tray of plated appetizers across the pass. Brian just smiled, the same smile he always gave that comment. "I like the hours." Walter didn't buy it, and they both knew he didn't buy it, but he let it go the way he always did, because some things a man only shares when he's ready, and Walter had learned a long time ago not to push. What none of them knew, what Brian had never said out loud to a single person at that hotel, was that 7 years ago he'd walked across a stage in a cap and gown with a degree in international relations and a fluency in 3 languages that his professors had been certain would carry him into rooms exactly like the one he now served coffee in. Diplomatic postings, translation work at the kind of summits that made the news. He used to imagine himself in those rooms as a participant, not the man refilling water glasses along the edge of it. Then his wife got sick, fast and without warning, and within 4 months there was a funeral and a mountain of medical bills and a 9-year-old who needed her father to show up every single day without exception. The suit he used to wear to interviews got packed into a box. The black uniform replaced it. He told himself it was temporary. Temporary turned into 6 years, the way it does for a lot of people who never meant to stay somewhere this long. He carried all of that quietly, the same way he carried trays, without letting it spill. By mid-morning, the hotel had shifted into a different gear entirely. Security walked the halls in pairs instead of alone. The general manager kept checking his watch and adjusting the same centerpiece 4 separate times. 2 men in dark suits who weren't hotel staff stood near the private dining room's entrance, speaking quietly into earpieces. Brian had seen enough important guests come through the Ashford Grand to recognize the difference between busy and this. This was something else. A man in a brown suit arrived first, warm and easy in a way that put people at ease before he'd said more than a few words. He shook hands with the valet, complimented the flowers, called two of the servers by name after being introduced only once, which impressed everyone on the floor enough that they started talking about him before he'd even sat down. Brian watched him work the room the way some people work a room for a living, and something about how effortless it looked made Brian's guard tighten just slightly, though he couldn't have said why. He assumed the man was simply another investor, confident, charming, nothing more. Then the cars started arriving outside. The first few were the kind of vehicles that belonged to people important enough to have somebody else drive them. Then the black car came, the one that made even the valets straighten their posture, and the whole floor seemed to inhale at once. Evelyn Ashford stepped out of it like she'd done this 10,000 times before, because she probably had. She moved through the lobby without hurrying, the way people move when hurrying has never once helped them get what they needed. The general manager met her at the door with both hands practically shaking. Brian picked up the silver coffee service without being asked, because he already knew, the way you know these things after enough years on a floor like this, that he was about to be the one assigned to that room. He was right. He carried the tray in behind her, past the two men in dark suits, into a room that smelled like fresh flowers and old money, and the particular kind of tension that comes right before something important either succeeds or falls apart. That was when he saw the translator for the first time, standing near Evelyn's chair, reviewing a folder of notes with the calm efficiency of a man who did this for a living and had never once had a meeting go wrong. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. And in that 1 second, something in the translator's expression flickered, just barely, just enough for a man trained to read rooms for a living to catch it. Brian didn't know yet what that flicker meant. He only knew, setting the coffee down with hands that were suddenly not as steady as they should have been, that something about this meeting was already wrong before a single word of it had been spoken. The meeting began the way important meetings always begin, at the Ashford Grand, with everyone on their best behavior and nobody quite looking at anyone else too long. Evelyn Ashford took her seat at the head of the table, folder open in front of her, pen capped beside it like she wasn't in any hurry to use it. The man in the brown suit sat 2 chairs down, relaxed in the particular way of someone who'd already decided how the day was going to end. 3 regional investors sat across from them, the kind of men who'd flown in for exactly this and nothing else. Brian moved along the edge of the room, filling water glasses, refreshing coffee, present in the way furniture is present. Nobody at that table looked at him twice. That was the job. He'd made peace with being unseen a long time ago, and most days it didn't cost him anything to be invisible. Today it would cost him almost everything. The translator opened with something warm, an introduction meant to put the investors at ease, and for a few minutes it worked exactly the way these things are supposed to work. Evelyn spoke in careful, measured English about partnership and shared opportunity. The translator turned her words into French, smooth and unhurried, and the investors nodded along, relaxed, receptive. Brian refilled a water glass and kept walking. Then, somewhere around the 10-minute mark, something shifted, so small he almost missed it. Evelyn made an offer, generous by any measure, the kind of number that should have gotten a smile out of anyone sitting at that table. The translator turned it into French. One of the investors frowned. Brian slowed near the sideboard, pretending to check a stack of napkins that didn't need checking. He replayed the sentence in his head, the real one, the one Evelyn had actually said, and set it beside the one that had just left the translator's mouth. They weren't the same sentence, not close. Where Evelyn had offered flexibility, the translator had used a word that implied she expected something in return, something closer to a demand than an offer. Brian told himself he'd misheard. He'd been away from real fluency for years, and maybe the distance had worn something down in him that he hadn't noticed until now. He kept listening anyway. Evelyn spoke again, this time about timeline, patient and reasonable, willing to work around whatever schedule made sense for the investor's side. The translator's French came out clipped, almost impatient, framing her patience as pressure. One of the investors shifted in his seat. Another exchanged a brief look with the man beside him, the kind of look that meant something had just landed wrong. Brian's stomach tightened. He moved to refill Evelyn's water glass, giving himself a reason to be close enough to hear clearly, and what he heard in the next exchange erased any doubt he'd been holding on to. A simple clarifying question, the sort any careful investor might ask, came back through the translator, sounding like an accusation. Evelyn's genuinely curious tone had been rewritten into something that sounded almost combative. This wasn't a translator struggling with nuance. Struggling looked different. Struggling had hesitation in it, uncertainty, the small stumbles of someone reaching for the right word. This had none of that. Every distortion landed clean and confident, delivered with the same easy smile the translator had worn since the meeting began. Someone was doing this on purpose. Brian straightened the coffee service and made himself breathe normally, though normal was the last thing he felt. He glanced at the man in the brown suit, expecting to see the same alarm building in him that was building in Brian, and found nothing. The man sat back in his chair, relaxed, occasionally nodding along like the conversation was proceeding exactly as expected. He had no idea. Nobody at that table had any idea, except the one person nobody was looking at. The investor's body language kept closing, inch by inch, the way people close off when they start to feel like they're being managed instead of respected. One of them asked a follow-up question, sharper this time, clearly bracing for another unpleasant answer. The translator delivered Evelyn's warm, conciliatory response as something clipped and dismissive. Brian watched a decade of careful planning come apart in real time, mistranslation by mistranslation, and no one in that room could see it happening except him. He thought about walking away. Finishing his rounds, refilling water somewhere else, letting whatever was going to happen simply happen. It wasn't his meeting. It wasn't his deal. He had a daughter waiting for him at the end of this shift, and a stack of unopened bills under yesterday's mail, and none of that had anything to do with billion-dollar negotiations or a translator with something to hide. Then Evelyn made her strongest offer yet, generous enough that it should have closed the gap in the room entirely, should have brought every investor at that table leaning forward instead of back. The translator turned it into an ultimatum. One investor closed his folder halfway, a small motion, but Brian caught it, and it landed in his chest like something breaking. Another leaned back and crossed his arms. The third exchanged a look with the man beside him, and this time neither of them bothered to hide it. Perhaps, one of them said quietly, in English good enough that he didn't need the translation, we should reconsider whether this is the right partnership. Evelyn's expression flickered, confusion breaking through her composure for just a second before she caught it and smoothed it back into professionalism. She had no idea why a conversation that had started so warmly was suddenly on the edge of collapse. She was reading the room correctly. She just wasn't reading the actual words being spoken in it. Brian stood near the sideboard with a coffee pot he'd forgotten he was holding, watching a deal worth hundreds of jobs slide toward the edge of a table, and understood with total certainty that nothing happening in that room was an accident. Someone wanted this deal to fail, and in about 90 seconds, if nobody said anything, it was going to. Brian stood at the edge of that room holding a coffee pot that had gone cold in his hands, and for the first time all morning, he let himself ask the question he'd been avoiding since the 10-minute mark. What happens if I say something and I'm wrong? He knew the answer before he'd finished asking it. If he was wrong, he wasn't just wrong about a translation. He was a waiter who'd interrupted the most important meeting the Ashford Grand had hosted in years, who'd accused a certified interpreter of lying in front of a woman worth more than the entire hotel, based on nothing but his own gut and a fluency he hadn't used in real conversation in almost 7 years. There would be no coming back from that, not a warning, not a write-up. The kind of mistake that ends careers doesn't leave room for second chances, and his manager wouldn't need much convincing to agree. He thought about Maya immediately, the way he always thought about Maya first, before rent, before anything else. He pictured himself explaining to a 9-year-old why they had to move again, why the bedroom she'd finally started decorating with her own drawings might not be theirs much longer. He pictured the conversation with brutal clarity, the careful way he'd have to say it so she wouldn't be scared, the way she'd nod anyway, like she understood, even when she was too young to really understand any of it. He'd built an entire life around not putting her through moments like that. And here he was, 30 seconds from a decision that could bring one crashing down on both of them. Brian glanced toward the head of the table again. Evelyn's pen was still capped, but her composure had thinned just slightly at the edges, confusion working its way into the corners of her expression, even as she kept her voice even and professional. She had no idea what was happening to her own words. She was watching a partnership unravel and had no way of understanding why, and something about that, about watching someone get quietly deceived without any way to defend herself, sat wrong in Brian's chest in a way rent and job security couldn't quite override. The translator kept going, smooth, confident, untouched by whatever storm Brian was standing in the middle of. He said something else, something Evelyn had clearly meant as reassurance, and it came out through French, sounding like a warning. One of the investor's jaws tightened. Brian's hands found the edge of the sideboard and gripped it, steadying himself against something that had nothing to do with balance. He thought of his wife, the way he still did sometimes in moments that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the person she'd shaped him into. She'd never once, in the entire time he knew her, let a convenient silence pass for peace. She used to say it plainly, the kind of thing that sounded almost too simple until you were standing exactly where Brian was standing now. Truth doesn't get less important just because telling it is expensive. He'd buried that voice under 6 years of silence, the same 6 years he'd buried the rest of who he used to be, and it picked this exact moment to come back to him whole. Evelyn reached for the folder in front of her, the motion small but final. The kind of gesture people make right before they decide a conversation isn't worth continuing. If she closed that folder, if she stood up and walked out of that room believing these investors had turned cold and hostile for reasons that didn't exist, the deal was gone. Not delayed. Gone. And whatever came after that, for the neighborhoods counting on those jobs, for whatever second chance those partnerships were supposed to represent, would go with it. Brian's whole body understood, before his mind fully caught up, that he was already moving. He stepped away from the sideboard. The restaurant manager, positioned near the doorway with the tight, watchful posture of a man responsible for everything that happened on his floor, noticed instantly. His eyes went wide, then sharp, a silent and unmistakable order for Brian to stay exactly where he was. Brian kept walking. One of the security men near the door shifted his weight, some instinct in him registering movement that didn't belong. Brian felt the eyes on him from every direction now, felt the specific kind of exposure that comes from breaking a rule everyone in the room knows by heart without needing it explained. Every part of his training told him to stop. 6 years of knowing his place, of staying exactly where he was supposed to stay, of being the reliable one who never called attention to himself, screamed at him to turn back toward the sideboard and let this play out the way it was clearly going to play out with or without him. He took another step instead. Evelyn's fingers touched the edge of the folder. Brian closed the last few feet between himself and her chair, setting the coffee pot down on the tray with a care that felt almost absurd given what he was about to do, like some part of him still refused to let go of professionalism even in the middle of throwing it away entirely. He leaned in. The room around him seemed to slow down, the way rooms do right before something in them changes permanently. He could hear his own pulse. He could hear, faintly, the translator's voice still moving through another sentence, another quiet distortion nobody else could catch. Brian opened his mouth. He didn't know yet whether the next 6 words were going to save that partnership or end his career. He only knew, standing there with his hand still resting on the edge of the tray, that he'd spent 6 years choosing silence to protect his daughter, and for the first time since the funeral, silence felt like the more dangerous choice of the two. The words left his mouth before he could stop them, quiet enough that only Evelyn would hear, loud enough to end everything he'd built these last 6 years if he was wrong. "Ma'am, your translator is lying to you." The room did not explode into chaos. It went the opposite direction, into a silence so complete Brian could hear the ice settling in someone's water glass 3 seats down. A fork stopped halfway to a mouth. The man in the brown suit turned his head slowly, the way people turn when they're sure they've misheard something and are waiting for the world to correct itself before they have to react to it. It didn't correct itself. The translator's expression held for exactly 1 second, the practiced calm of a man who'd done this job for years, and knew how to keep his face steady under pressure. Then something underneath it cracked, just barely, a flicker that vanished, as fast as it appeared but not fast enough. Brian saw it. He'd spent the last 20 minutes learning to read that face, and what he saw now wasn't confusion. It was the look of a man who'd just been caught. The restaurant manager, still frozen near the doorway, looked like he'd aged 5 years in 5 seconds. Security shifted forward, one man taking a half step toward the table before catching himself, waiting for a signal nobody had given yet. Evelyn turned in her chair to face Brian directly, slow and deliberate, studying him the way you study something that doesn't fit the picture you'd already built of a room. She didn't call for security. She didn't dismiss him with the wave of a hand that would have ended this in half a second. She simply asked the only question that mattered. "What did you just say to me?" Brian's pulse was doing something violent behind his ribs, but his voice, when it came, stayed level. He'd spent years learning to keep his hands steady while carrying full trays across a crowded floor, and something about that same discipline held him together now. "I apologize for interrupting, ma'am. I understand the risk I'm taking by saying this, but several of your statements have not been translated the way you spoke them." Somewhere behind him, one of the executives muttered something under his breath about a waiter losing his mind. Nobody laughed. The tension in the room had shifted too far for anyone to find it funny. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, with focus, the look of a woman recalculating a situation in real time. "Can you explain what you mean?" Brian nodded. He thought, for half a second, about the box in his closet full of certifications nobody at this hotel had ever asked to see, about a version of himself that used to do exactly this kind of work for a living. That version of him stepped forward now, steady, precise. "A few minutes ago, you offered flexibility on the timeline. You said you were willing to adjust based on what worked for their operations." He paused, choosing the words carefully. What was translated made it sound like you were demanding something in return, like the flexibility came with conditions you never mentioned. The translator shifted in his seat. "This is absurd. Nuance is lost between languages constantly. This is normal. This happens in every negotiation." "There's more," Brian said, not raising his voice, not looking away from Evelyn. "When you asked a clarifying question about their production timeline, a simple question, curious, not confrontational, it came across in French, sounding like an accusation. That's not a nuance issue. That's a different sentence." One of the investors leaned forward for the first time since the meeting started, his earlier coldness replaced by something closer to alarm. He said something quiet to the man beside him, and though Brian didn't catch all of it, he caught enough to know the investor was reconsidering everything he'd assumed about the last 20 minutes. The translator's composure was fraying now, visible even to people who hadn't been watching him as closely as Brian had. "I've been doing this work for 15 years. I don't need a waiter second-guessing my accuracy." "I'm not asking you to trust me," Brian said quietly. "I'm asking her to verify it." Evelyn studied Brian for a long moment, the kind of silence that felt heavier than anything spoken in the last hour. Then she reached for her phone, and the decision in her face was already made before she'd said a word. "I'd like an independent interpreter on this call," she said, dialing a number from her contacts. "Now, if possible." The translator started to protest, something about how unnecessary this was, how insulting it was to bring in a third party over what he called a simple misunderstanding, but his voice had lost the confidence it carried 20 minutes earlier. Nobody in the room was fully listening to him anymore. Every eye had shifted toward Evelyn's phone, waiting. Brian stood there with his hands loosely at his sides, aware of every second stretching longer than it should have, aware that he had just done something there was no undoing. He had no idea whether the next few minutes would confirm everything he'd just said or destroy the last shred of credibility he had left in that room. The call connected. A calm, professional voice came through the speaker, introducing herself as a certified interpreter, asking what she could help with. Evelyn looked once more at Brian, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before she turned back to the phone. "I'd like you to translate something for us," she said, word for word, exactly as it was said. The room went still again, waiting. Nobody, including Brian, knew yet whether the next few minutes would prove him right, or finally give the restaurant manager the excuse he needed to have Brian escorted out of a room he was never supposed to have spoken in at all. Real courage often comes from ordinary people who decide that doing the right thing matters more than protecting themselves. If stories like this one stay with you, subscribe now, because what happens next is worth being here for. The independent interpreter's voice came through the phone clean and unhurried, the calm of someone with nothing riding on the outcome except accuracy. Evelyn set the phone in the center of the table, screen facing up, and nodded for the recording of the earlier conversation to begin. The hotel's own translator sat rigid in his seat, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere just past the table's edge. The first playback was short, one of Evelyn's offers on partnership terms, spoken plainly and generously. The independent interpreter translated it into French, word for word, and the difference from what the room had actually heard an hour earlier was immediate. Where the hotel's translator had made it sound conditional, almost transactional, the real translation carried nothing but flexibility and goodwill. One of the investors sat back slightly, recalculating. The second playback landed harder. Evelyn's simple, curious question about production timelines, the one that had come out sounding like an accusation, was translated by the independent interpreter exactly as it had been intended. Curious, respectful, nothing in it remotely close to confrontation. The man in the brown suit, who had spent the last hour believing everything in that room was proceeding exactly as planned, slowly stopped smiling. Brian watched the realization land on his face in real time, the understanding that whatever had almost collapsed this deal had nothing to do with the investor's hesitation and everything to do with the man sitting 3 seats down from him. The third and fourth playbacks confirmed what the first two had already made clear. A generous investment offer that had been twisted into an ultimatum, a gesture of goodwill that had been flattened into something cold and dismissive. Each one landed in the room like another piece of evidence nobody could argue with, because the proof wasn't opinion. It was simply what had been said, set beside what had been claimed. The hotel's translator tried once more to explain it away. He mentioned cultural context. He mentioned the difficulty of real-time interpretation under pressure, how easy it was for tone to shift without any intention behind it. Nobody at the table was listening anymore. The independent interpreter's flat, professional confirmations had done more damage to his credibility than anything Brian could have argued in an hour. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Thank you," she said quietly into the phone, then ended the call. She turned to the translator, and for the first time since the meeting began, her tone carried something sharper underneath its calm. "You've been changing my words for the last hour." He opened his mouth to answer, but there wasn't really an answer left to give. Whatever explanation he might have offered had already been disproven 4 times over, in his own recorded voice, played back against a stranger's honest translation. Evelyn looked toward the restaurant manager standing frozen near the door. "Please have someone escort him out. The rest of us will continue once we have a translator I can actually trust in this room." There was no shouting, no dramatic confession. Just the quiet, almost anticlimactic sight of a man removing his own headset and gathering his folder while 2 members of hotel security stepped forward to walk him out, his composure cracking only slightly as he passed the investors he'd spent the last hour trying to turn against Evelyn. Brian stood off to the side through all of it, saying nothing, watching a version of vindication he hadn't expected to actually witness. He'd braced himself, walking into that meeting, for the version of this story where he was wrong, where the room turned on him instead. Standing here now, watching the truth confirm itself 4 times over, felt almost stranger than the fear had. The investors, no longer operating under the belief that Evelyn had been cold or evasive, softened almost immediately. One of them apologized, quietly, for the tension he'd let build over the last hour. Another admitted he'd nearly walked out 20 minutes earlier and was glad now that he hadn't. Evelyn accepted both with the same steady grace she'd carried through the entire ordeal, already shifting the conversation back toward the terms that mattered. Brian began to step back toward the sideboard, assuming his part in this was finished, that the rest belonged to people whose names were actually on the paperwork. He didn't get far before Evelyn's voice stopped him. "Mr. Robinson!" He turned. The whole table turned with him, curiosity plain on every face, the kind of attention Brian had spent 6 years carefully avoiding. "Thank you," Evelyn said simply. "I don't know what would have happened to this partnership if you hadn't said something." Brian felt his shoulders loosen slightly for the first time since he'd set that coffee pot down an hour earlier. "I only wanted everyone to hear what was actually being said." Evelyn studied him for a moment longer than the exchange strictly required, something calculating behind her eyes that Brian didn't yet understand. Then she nodded once, and the negotiations resumed around him, warmer now, easier, moving toward the agreement they'd almost lost less than an hour earlier. Brian returned to his post along the wall, picking his tray back up, resuming the invisible rhythm of the job he'd done for 6 years without complaint. He assumed the moment had passed, that by tomorrow this would be nothing more than a story whispered among the staff, the day the waiter said something crazy and somehow got away with it. He had no idea the man in the brown suit was still watching him from across the table, leaning toward Evelyn to murmur something too quiet for Brian to catch. "That man," he said, "does not belong carrying coffee trays." Without the distortion pulling every sentence sideways, the negotiation moved the way negotiations are supposed to move. Warm, direct, almost easy. Within 20 minutes, the tension that had nearly ended the partnership was gone entirely, replaced by the kind of relaxed momentum that comes when everyone in a room finally understands they've been arguing over nothing real. Evelyn laughed at something one of the investors said. Someone refilled glasses that weren't Brian's to refill, because by then he'd quietly stepped back into the rhythm of the floor, present again in the way furniture is present. He caught the tail end of the man in the brown suit's murmured comment to Evelyn, the one about not belonging carrying coffee trays, and told himself it didn't mean anything. People said things like that in the heat of a moment. By tomorrow it would be forgotten, filed away with everything else that happened in that room, and never mentioned again. The meeting wrapped an hour later with handshakes instead of tension, the kind of ending that made the earlier chaos feel almost unreal in hindsight. Brian cleared the table like he'd cleared 1,000 tables before it, careful and unremarkable, and by the time the last car pulled away from the entrance, the floor had already moved on to the next service. Almost. Word travels fast on a restaurant floor, faster than anything else in the building. By the time Brian finished his shift, half the staff had heard some version of what happened, and none of the versions agreed with each other. One waiter swore Brian had nearly gotten arrested. Another insisted Evelyn Ashford herself had asked for him by name before he'd even said a word. A server named Priya, who'd worked beside Brian for 3 years without knowing much more about him than his coffee order, caught him near the service station with something between admiration and disbelief on her face. "You're lucky she didn't have you thrown out," she said, not unkindly, just stating what everyone assumed had been the obvious risk. Brian shrugged. Maybe. He wasn't interested in being the story of the day. He finished his shift the way he finished every shift, checking his section twice, making sure nothing was left undone before he clocked out, his mind already halfway home to Maya before his feet caught up. That evening, he walked in carrying a small paper bag of leftover pastries the kitchen let staff take at the end of service, the same thing he brought home most Tuesdays. Maya was at the kitchen table finishing homework, feet swinging beneath her chair, and she looked up the second the door opened. "Did anything interesting happen today?" she asked, the same question she asked most nights, mostly out of habit rather than expectation of an actual answer. Brian set the pastries on the counter and considered, for half a second, telling her the truth. Then he thought better of it. Some things a father carries alone, not because a child couldn't understand them, but because they shouldn't have to. "Just another day at work," he said, and set 2 pastries on a plate for her like he always did. She accepted the answer easily, moving on to a story about a classmate who'd gotten in trouble for something involving glue, and Brian let himself sink into the ordinary rhythm of the evening. Dinner, homework check, the small rituals that made up the life he'd built to protect her. For a few hours, the meeting felt like something that had happened to someone else, in another building entirely. The phone rang a little after 9, once Maya was already asleep. Brian almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was a scam call or a wrong number, until he saw the hotel's main line on the screen. His stomach dropped before he'd even answered. It was the general manager's assistant, polite and brief, informing him he was expected in the executive conference room the following afternoon. No explanation, no further detail, just a time and a request that he not be late. Brian sat on the edge of his bed for a long time after he hung up, running through every possible reason a call like that could come this late in the evening. None of the reasons he could think of were good ones. He told himself he was probably being let go, quietly, without the mess of doing it on the floor in front of coworkers. It would make sense. It would be the easiest way for the hotel to handle a waiter who'd embarrassed management in front of their most important guest of the year. Sleep didn't come easily that night. He lay awake, running the day back through his mind, replaying every version of what tomorrow might look like, most of them ending with him clearing out his locker and figuring out how to explain unemployment to a 9-year-old who trusted him completely. He told himself not to expect anything else. Hope had disappointed him before, more than once, and he'd learned the hard way not to hand it too much room to grow. What Brian didn't know, lying awake in the dark, going over every worst-case scenario he could invent, was that across town, Evelyn Ashford was doing something entirely different with her evening. She'd asked her team to quietly look into the waiter who'd risked everything to tell her the truth, and what they were finding didn't look anything like a man who deserved to lose his job. They found a university transcript with his name near the top, language certifications that had never once appeared on his employment file. 6 years of quiet, unrecognized overtime, never once used as leverage for a raise or a promotion. The man in the brown suit, reviewing the same file over a late dinner, said it plainly to no one in particular. "Character like that," he murmured, "you can't teach it." Brian arrived at the executive conference room 5 minutes early, dressed in the same uniform he wore every day, feeling distinctly out of place in a room built for people who wore suits instead. He'd spent the entire walkover rehearsing an apology, some version of an explanation for why he'd stepped so far outside his role, in case that was what today turned out to require. Evelyn was already seated when he walked in, alone at the long table, no folder of complaints in front of her, no lawyer waiting to formalize a dismissal. Just her, a pot of coffee neither of them had touched, and an expression Brian couldn't quite read. "Please, sit," she said. He sat. "I want to apologize," Brian started, "if what happened yesterday caused any problems for the hotel, or for you." Evelyn shook her head before he could finish. "That's not why you're here." Brian waited, unsure what else there was to say. "I'm not interested in discussing yesterday's mistake," she said, "because there wasn't one. What I'm interested in is you." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he said nothing, and Evelyn let the silence sit there for a moment before continuing. "Tell me about your education." Brian hesitated. Nobody at the Ashford Grand had asked him a question like that in 6 years. "International relations," he said finally. "I graduated with a focus on diplomatic communication. Languages? French, German, English, obviously." He almost smiled at how strange it felt to say it out loud, plainly, without the instinct to minimize it that he'd carried for years. "I studied abroad twice. I was on track for postings that involved translation work at a diplomatic level." Evelyn nodded slowly, like she was confirming something she'd already suspected. "That's what my team found when they looked into your background. What they couldn't find was any explanation for why a man with that kind of training has spent 6 years serving coffee." Brian felt the old, familiar instinct to deflect, to keep the explanation short and clean, the way he always kept it when anyone got too close to the subject. But something about the directness of her question, and the fact that she'd clearly already done the work of finding out the parts he hadn't offered, made the shorter version feel dishonest. "My wife got sick," he said. "Fast. There wasn't much warning, and there wasn't much time. She passed away about 6 years ago, and I had a daughter who needed someone showing up for her every single day. The job market for diplomatic postings isn't exactly built around single fathers who can't relocate on short notice or work unpredictable hours. This job was steady, it paid on time, it let me be home every night." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, softened, the calculating look from the day before replaced with something closer to respect. The man in the brown suit, seated at the far end of the table, looked down at his hands. "I don't believe your story should end inside a restaurant," Evelyn said finally. Brian looked up. "I'd like to offer you an interview," she continued, "for a position within my organization's International Operations Division. Not because of what happened yesterday, though I won't pretend that isn't part of how I found you, but because you clearly have the skills for it, and you've apparently had them the whole time no one bothered to ask." Brian sat there for a long moment, certain he'd misheard her, running the sentence back through his mind twice before he trusted it enough to respond. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything today," Evelyn said. "Take the night. Think about it. This isn't charity, Mr. Robinson. I don't hand out positions because I feel sorry for someone. I'm offering this because I think you earned it. Yesterday, and probably every day before it, that nobody noticed." Brian left the hotel that evening in a kind of daze he hadn't felt in years, the walk home passing in pieces he barely remembered, his mind replaying the conversation over and over, like he needed to hear it enough times to believe it had actually happened. At dinner, Maya noticed he was quieter than usual, pushing her food around her plate while she studied him with the particular attentiveness only a child who'd learned to read her parents' moods could manage. "Dad," she said, "are we okay?" Brian looked up, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his smile carried something other than the practiced reassurance he usually gave her. This one was real, uncertain and hopeful, in a way he hadn't let himself feel since long before she was born. "Yeah," he said, "I think we might be better than okay." She didn't ask him to explain further, satisfied with the answer in the way children often are, and went back to her dinner while Brian sat there turning the day over in his mind. Later that night, after she'd gone to bed, he found himself standing in front of the closet, staring at a box he hadn't opened in years. He pulled it down slowly, dust sliding off the lid, and lifted out the suit he'd worn to his university graduation, folded the same way he'd folded it the day he packed it away. He held it up against himself in the mirror, unsure if it would even still fit, unsure of a lot of things all at once. If you've ever put your own future aside so someone you love could have one, you already understand what this moment cost Brian. Subscribe now. Stories like this one don't come around often. Brian said yes 3 days later, after turning the offer over so many times in his head that saying it out loud almost felt anticlimactic. The interview itself lasted less than an hour, mostly formalities, since Evelyn had already made her decision the moment she'd asked him to sit down in that conference room. What came after the yes turned out to be the harder part. The transition wasn't handed to him. Nobody at Evelyn's organization treated him like a favor being repaid, and Brian was grateful for that, even as it made the first few months brutal in ways he hadn't fully braced for. He was 7 years removed from real fluency work, and 7 years is a long time for a language to sit quiet in the back of someone's mind. The French came back faster than he expected, muscle memory reasserting itself the moment he had reason to use it again. The German took longer, stubborn and rusty, full of words he had to relearn like a man dusting off tools he hadn't touched since he was young enough to think he'd use them forever. He studied every night after Maya went to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with a laptop and a stack of borrowed textbooks, going over trade terminology and modern negotiation frameworks that hadn't existed yet when he was in school. Some nights he stayed up long past midnight and still felt behind the next morning. More than once he sat there at 2 in the morning, wondering if he'd made a mistake, if the version of himself that used to belong in rooms like this had aged out of existence somewhere in the last 6 years, replaced permanently by a man who only knew how to carry trays and fold napkins into precise triangles. He kept going anyway. Quitting had never really been part of how Brian operated, whether the fight in front of him was medical bills or a rusty vocabulary. Evelyn's team noticed things about him slowly, the way you notice a pattern only after it's repeated enough times to become obvious. Brian wasn't the sharpest voice in most meetings. He didn't dominate a room the way some of the executives around him did, the ones who'd never had to learn humility because nothing in their careers had forced it on them. But he was consistently the most prepared person at the table, the one who'd read every document twice and caught details other people glossed over. He asked careful questions instead of confident assertions, And more often than not, his careful questions turned out to be the ones that mattered. His years serving tables, invisible in rooms full of powerful people, had taught him something most of his new colleagues had never needed to learn. He knew how to read a room without being noticed reading it. He knew how tone shifted a half-second before words caught up to it. The same instinct that had let him catch a lying translator when nobody else in that dining room had picked up on it. It turned out that skill translated into something valuable in international negotiations too, a kind of quiet perceptiveness that came from years of being underestimated. Slowly, the work stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like something closer to purpose. 6 months in, he handled his first solo translation during a mid-level negotiation, nervous enough beforehand that he barely slept the night before, and steady enough during it that nobody in the room could have guessed it was his first time carrying that kind of responsibility alone. Afterward, one of the senior directors pulled him aside, not to correct anything, just to tell him he'd done well. Brian drove home that night with something loosening in his chest that had been tight for longer than he could remember. A knot he hadn't fully realized was there until it started to ease. His income changed steadily over those months, not dramatically, not overnight, but enough. Enough that the envelopes with little plastic windows stopped piling up under the mail. Enough that when the lease came up on their old apartment, Brian didn't have to think twice before looking somewhere better. He found a 2-bedroom place across town, small but solid, with a room that was entirely Maya's for the first time in her life. Walls she got to pick the color for herself. She stood in the empty room the day they moved in, spinning slowly with her arms out like she was trying to take up as much of it as possible before the furniture arrived. "This whole thing is mine?" she asked, like she needed to hear him confirm it twice. "All yours." She hugged him around the waist, the same hug she used to give him at the school gate, except this time there was nothing underneath it that needed reassurance. Brian held onto that hug a beat longer than usual. That evening, once the last box was unpacked and Maya was asleep in her new room, Brian stood in the quiet of the living room holding a framed photograph of his late wife, the one they'd taken the summer before she got sick, both of them laughing at something neither of them could remember anymore. He found a place for it on the wall above the bookshelf, hung it carefully, and stepped back to look at it. "We made it," he said quietly, to no one, to her, to whatever part of the last 6 years had needed saying out loud. It wasn't a perfect life. There were still hard days, still moments where the weight of everything he'd carried alone caught up with him in ways he didn't always see coming. But there was something in the apartment now that had been missing for longer than he wanted to admit. Room to breathe. Room for Maya to grow into a childhood that didn't require her to worry about things 9-year-olds shouldn't have to worry about. He kept in touch with a few people from the Ashford Grand, mostly Walter, who called every so often just to check in, never surprised in the slightest by how things had turned out. "Told you," Walter said once, over the phone. "Too educated for that place." Brian laughed. "You never said it like it was going anywhere." "Didn't need to," Walter said. "Some things just take the right room to prove themselves in." Nearly 2 years passed that way, steady and unremarkable in the best sense of the word, Brian building a career that finally matched the life he'd once imagined for himself, before everything got interrupted and rebuilt into something different. He didn't think much anymore about the man he used to be before the funeral, before the uniform, before 6 years of quiet sacrifice. He'd stopped mourning that version of himself somewhere along the way, replaced by a version that had earned everything he now had, one careful step at a time. Then, on an ordinary afternoon that felt like every other afternoon that month, an envelope arrived at the apartment with Evelyn Ashford's name on the return address, inviting him somewhere he hadn't expected to be invited back to. The invitation sat on the kitchen counter for 2 days before Brian opened it, mostly because he already suspected what it was and wanted to sit with the anticipation a little longer before it turned into something real. When he finally slid it open, it was simpler than he expected. A card, embossed with the name of a vocational training center he'd never heard of, inviting him to its opening ceremony the following month. At the bottom, in Evelyn's own handwriting instead of a printed signature, a short note. "This wouldn't exist without you. I'd like you to see it." He read it twice before setting it down, and it took him a moment to place why his hands weren't quite steady. It wasn't nerves. not the way it had been nerves 2 years earlier. It was something closer to disbelief, the strange sensation of watching a single afternoon that nearly ended his career fold itself, slowly and quietly, into something that had grown far beyond that one dining room. He brought Maya with him the day of the ceremony, 11 years old now, taller than she'd been the last time any of this started, and considerably less patient about the length of the car ride than she used to be. She'd asked a dozen questions on the drive over, most of which Brian answered honestly for the first time, having stopped years ago pretending the meeting that changed their lives had been nothing more than an ordinary day at work. "So this is because you told on that guy?" she asked, only half joking. "Something like that. You should get a plaque." Brian laughed. "I'll settle for the invitation." The neighborhood surrounding the training center looked almost nothing like the version Brian remembered driving past years earlier, back when it had been mostly boarded storefronts and empty lots waiting for investment that never seemed to arrive. Now there were small businesses lining both sides of the street, families out with strollers, a bakery with a line out the door that hadn't existed 2 years ago. Brian parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance slowly, taking in details he hadn't expected to feel this much about. The ceremony itself was modest compared to what Brian had imagined. No stage full of speeches, no cameras beyond a local news crew capturing footage for a segment that would run for maybe 90 seconds that evening. Just a ribbon strung across the entrance of a converted warehouse, folding chairs set up for the families who'd come to see their children or siblings or parents enroll in trades that hadn't been accessible to them a year earlier. Electrical work, culinary training, small business development classes taught by people who actually understood the neighborhood they were teaching in. Brian walked through slowly with Maya beside him, watching apprentices in crisp new uniforms practicing skills in workshop stations set up along the far wall, watching parents who looked the way he remembered feeling 6 years earlier, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with carrying more than anyone around them realized. Almost nobody recognized him. He preferred it that way. Evelyn found him near the back of the crowd before the ribbon cutting began, dressed simply for the occasion, warmer in her greeting than Brian remembered her being in that first dining room years ago. "You came," she said. "Wouldn't have missed it." She glanced toward Maya, who was watching the workshop stations with open curiosity, and something in Evelyn's expression softened further. She's grown. Feels like it happened overnight. Evelyn didn't make a show of introducing Brian to the small group of local officials and community leaders gathered near the entrance, didn't turn his presence into a moment designed to highlight her own generosity. She simply mentioned him once, quietly, to the center's newly appointed director. "This is one of the people who made today possible," she said. Nothing more, letting the sentence carry whatever weight it needed to carry without elaboration. The director shook Brian's hand warmly, clearly not needing the full story to understand there was one, and moved on to greet the next arrival. Brian appreciated that Evelyn never turned him into the centerpiece of her own success story. It let him stand at the edges of the ceremony the way he'd stood at the edges of that dining room years earlier, present without needing to be seen, which had always been the version of himself he was most comfortable being. The man in the brown suit approached him near the ribbon, older now, a little heavier around the middle, the same easy warmth he'd carried into that first meeting still fully intact. "You know," he said, shaking Brian's hand, "I almost didn't take you seriously that day. Most people wouldn't have." "I think about it sometimes," the man admitted, "how close all of this came to falling apart over something nobody but you could see." Brian looked out at the crowd gathered around the entrance, apprentices and families and neighbors who had no idea any of this had started with a single sentence, spoken quietly behind a chair in a hotel dining room. "I'm just glad somebody finally heard the truth," Brian said. The ribbon cutting happened a few minutes later, brief and understated, more meaningful in the faces of the people watching it than in the ceremony itself. Applause rose and fell across the crowd, and the doors opened to a building that would spend the coming years quietly changing the trajectory of more lives than Brian would ever be able to count. Maya slipped her hand into his as the crowd began moving forward into the building, the same easy gesture she'd made 1,000 times before, except now there was nothing underneath it that needed reassurance. She looked up at him, taking in the scene the way children take in moments they don't yet fully understand the size of. "Dad," she said, "did you really do all this?" Brian looked out over the crowd, the apprentices, the families, the neighborhood that had been rebuilt, one partnership at a time, because a translator's lie hadn't been allowed to stand. "I just said something true," he told her. Everything after that was other people deciding what to do with it. She seemed satisfied with that answer, tugging his hand gently toward the entrance, eager to see the rest of the building before the afternoon ended. Brian let himself be pulled along, watching the late afternoon light settle over the crowd, over the ribbon now lying loose on the ground, over a building that hadn't existed the last time he'd stood on this street. He thought, not for the first time, about something his late wife used to say, back when their life together was ordinary in ways he hadn't known yet to be grateful for. The most important people in a room are rarely the ones sitting closest to the money. Sometimes they're the ones standing quietly behind a chair, carrying a tray nobody's paying attention to, waiting for the moment truth needs somebody willing to risk everything to say it out loud. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love for you to subscribe. Before you go, leave a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read your comments, and I always enjoy seeing your thoughts and perspectives. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, just tap the next video on your screen. I'll see you there.